In this video, we will talk about dates in Tableau. We will start by looking at default properties for dates, and we will focus our discussion on what we call date part and date value. These concepts are important in understanding how dates work in Tableau. Sometimes, date parts and date values, they're often confused to being blue pills or green pills, or what we call discrete or continuous pills. But there's more to it than that. We will unpack the differences between these two, especially how these can affect the kinds of calculations and charts we can create. I'll see you in a bit. I have added chapters in the description should you want to jump to specific topics. I hope you will consider watching the whole video. There may be snippets here and there that you may find useful even if you're already familiar with dates in Tableau. Let's start by looking at some of the defaults. How dates look like and behave right off the bat. When you have your canvas open, your date fields will appear with a calendar icon like this. If the field contains a time component, the icon will be switched to a calendar icon with a clock, like this. When we drag a date field onto our canvas, we do not get the exact date field we see from the sidebar. When I drag over order date, I don't just get order date. Notice in here that what we are getting is actually year of order date. So the individual order dates has been rolled up to the year level. What we also get is a blue pill, which is a discrete field. So what we're really getting is a series of headers. In this video, I will mention discrete and continuous fields, or blue or green pills. But I also have another video that explains these concepts in more detail. I will link it up in the card above and description down below. Going back to some defaults, we also see a plus sign. So you have a plus sign right there. This is indicative of a hierarchy. This means that this pill potentially has several layers that we can unpack. This also means that this field is clickable. Again, just looking at the default properties, when we click on this plus sign on our shelf, this is what happens. There is going to be more levels after year. So we see quarter, month, day. Let's collapse this again. Just a quick note that your end users will have a different experience since they don't see any of your row shelf or your column shelves. Let's take a look at how these hierarchies show up for your end users. If we click on presentation mode, this is what they're going to see. And for them to be able to click on the hierarchy, they have to put their mouse pointer over the header or the axis of the date until they see the plus sign. And from here, they can expand or collapse. Note that this natural hierarchy is the default behavior of date fields in Tableau. However, please note that this behavior is dependent on the data source. If, let's say, your data source already enforces a certain kind of hierarchy, for example, in the case of cubes, you will not see this default behavior. Tableau will defer to the cube for the hierarchy structure of the date. Going back to what we have in this canvas, if, for example, we did not want the year, but we wanted specific dates displayed instead, we can use the shortcut right-click drag in a PC when we are placing our pills to canvas. So for example, in here, right-click drag. The equivalent shortcut in a Mac is option drag. This shortcut allows us to see the drop field window, and the drop field window allows us to specify exactly which variation of that field we want Tableau to use. For example, if we wanted to show the individual dates instead, we have two fields in here that we can specify. For now, let's just pick the discrete order date and display it. So now we're seeing the difference between the pill and the display. The default pill has given us a hierarchy rolled up to the year level with a plus sign, and it also displays just the year. The second pill, it's not rolled up, so it gives us each individual date value. Now let's look at some default properties at the field level. If we right-click the date field on the sidebar, so for example in here, right-click and go to default properties, there are two default properties in here that are very specific to dates. It's the date format and the fiscal year start. Let's look at the date format first. So clicking on date format, and this is what we're going to see. Different variations of date displays. There may be times where we want the year first, or perhaps we want the day first with a shortened year. And again, these are all the different variations. If, for example, you want a slightly different variation, a quick trick is to use a date format that is closest to what you need. For example, if I want the shortened month name, so March, and then a space, and then the day, comma, and let's say an apostrophe, and a shortened year. How can I do that? Because I don't see it in the default date formats. Let's choose this option and scroll all the way down to custom. And in here, we can see that the format has been pre-populated. And from here, we can make adjustments. So for example, we just need to move things around. So instead of having the day in the beginning, we're going to have month. We're going to put a space, DD, comma. And in here, we only want the shortened year. So remove the two Y's and then just put an apostrophe. For now, let's click on OK. Let's take a look at what this format looks like. Click on OK, and let's display it again. Right-click, drag, discrete date, and we can see that this is our default format. If you need other variations of the date format, I will recommend checking out the online documentation that Tableau provides. It provides a list of all supported date format symbols, and it's actually a long list, so it's quite flexible. The other default property that's available is when we right-click, go to Default Properties, we're going to see Fiscal Year Start. If your organization's fiscal year month does not start in January, but let's say in another month, for example, April, we can just change that from our default properties in Tableau. So let's give this a try and let's see how it affects Tableau. So for example, the moment you drag over order date, remember the default is it gives you the year level. What we are going to see now is no longer the calendar year. You're going to see the fiscal year. And as we expand this, we're going to see that the other levels will follow this fiscal year now. So as we click on year, it expands to quarter, click on quarter, expands to month. And we can see in here that fiscal year 2018, quarter 1 starts in April. January falls on the previous fiscal year on Q4. If you need to use calendar year in some views and fiscal year in some other views, I definitely recommend creating a duplicate field. So for example, order date, right-click, duplicate. And you can leave one as a calendar year and the other one as a fiscal year. This technique just allows you to have additional options. Let us now look at some date defaults at the data source level. In your canvas, when you right-click on your data source, you will find an option for date properties. Let's open this up. And then here you're going to see a few options. We have two types of calendars. The first one is standard Gregorian, and the other one is ISO 8601. For a standard Gregorian calendar, we can change the week start, the fiscal year start, which is very similar to an option we've seen in an earlier demo, as well as a date format. If we switch the default calendar to ISO 8601, we're going to see that there's actually not a lot of options we can change. Actually, there's none. It is worthwhile trying to understand how these two calendars are different. The ISO 8601 calendar is a week-based calendar. Weeks start on Mondays, and this calendar has a full 52 or 53 weeks, which equate to either 364 or 371 days instead of our usual regular 365 days. The first day of the ISO year is the Monday closest to January 1st. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. January 1st, 2012 falls on a Sunday, and what this means is that this day is actually still part of the previous ISO year 2011. 2012 starts on a Monday, which is January 2nd, 2012. For the following year, what we can see is December 31st, 2012 falls on a Monday, which means the new ISO year starts on this day, and January 1st is the second day of ISO year 2013. If your organization works with the ISO 8601 calendar, I definitely encourage you to look up additional resources to understand the rules on assigning these dates. Now let's talk about date part and date value. These are lesser known terms when referring to dates. Often, we talk about continuous date or discrete date, or blue pill or green pill for dates, but these are actually different concepts from date part and date value. Let's first take a look at what makes up a date. For example, February 1st, 2021. This date has year, it has month, and it has day. We also know that this comes after February 1st, 2020, and it comes before February 1st, 2022. Sometimes when we talk about dates, we also look at other properties such as the quarter number, maybe the week number, the day number, or even what day of the week it is. So for example, February 1st is on a Monday. Let's try to remember these characteristics as we investigate dates in Tableau. In Tableau, when we drag over a date field, by default what we get is a discrete pill. This is a blue pill. So essentially what we have is a series of headers. When we click on the drop-down for this particular pill, we are going to find that there are additional options for dates. We are also going to notice that there seems to be two sets of date options. If you take a look in here, it looks like year, quarter, month, day appears once, and there's a second set, year, quarter, month, week number, and day. We're also going to notice that our usual discrete and continuous is also here. We're not going to talk about discrete and continuous just yet. We are going to focus on the first two sets of options for dates. The first set of date options is your date part. And this is taking an individual piece of information that helps make up a date. So for example, we can take a look at just quarters. If we look at only the quarter information from all of our records, we may not be able to tell exactly when that quarter happened because we are only looking at a single piece of information. It's the same thing with month and the same thing with day. The second set of date options is what we call our date value. And notice the difference even with the examples that Tableau provide for us. The first set is always about just that individual piece of information regardless of when it happened. The second set of examples is always with respect to year. It's always with respect to time. So for the second set of date options, which is for date value, we're always looking at it from a chronological order. It's always with respect to time. We're not simply plucking out quarter or month. We're still seeing this in a chronological order. It is also worthwhile noting that date parts by default are blue or discrete, and date values by default are continuous or green. But these are just defaults. We can toggle the blue and green whether we have a date part or a date value. Let's look at this a bit more in Tableau. This is where we left off. We had year onto our rows, which means our year headers are vertically laid out. Let's move this to the column shelf to lay out our labels horizontally. And for now, let's add the sales measure. As we have mentioned earlier, when we simply drag over a date field onto your canvas, by default what you get is a discrete date part. Remember that this discrete year date part is equivalent to the year in the first option. Now notice what happens when we expand this hierarchy. When we have a date part and we expand it, what we get are different levels. These are still blue pills that produce headers for us. So the year label is this, and the quarter label is at the bottom. As we expand more, we are going to see that some of the labels go up. So year is at the top again, quarter has moved up, and month stays at the very bottom. By default, the header of the rightmost blue pill in Tableau stays at the bottom, and everything else is on top. What we should also notice is that when we expand discrete date parts, we get multiple pills. When we expanded year, we got quarter. When we expanded quarter, we got month. When we expand month, we get day. And this is significant because what this means is we can move the pills around to create different combinations that may not necessarily follow the chronological order, but gives us a slightly different insight of our data. For example, we can choose to take day out, we can choose to take quarter out, and in here, instead of year followed by the month, we can simply swap these two pills out, and now we have a chart called cycle plot. Cycle plots are great in identifying trends or seasonality. Another common chart that we can create when we are working with discrete date parts is a heat map or a highlight table. So let's take a look at that. On a new worksheet, let's drag over order date. And from here, we can either decide to expand the pills again, or we can also simply select the actual fields we want from the dropdown. So in this case, perhaps what we want to do is take away quarter and take away year. And using month and day, we're going to create a matrix. Let's set this to entire width. And if, for example, we are looking at sales, we can decide to take sales and put that in color. This is a very easy heat map, and it allows us to see slightly different insights. For example, we may notice that sales all the way to August is not doing as well as the sales from September to the end of the year. We can also easily see some of the outliers. If, for example, we wanted to show the numbers as well as the background color, we can simply copy our measure. So I'm going to press Ctrl, copy sales onto label, and from here, change the mark to a square. And this is what we call a highlight table. Let's remove the label for now. If, for example, we wanted to show the year as well, we can still take our discrete year date part and add it somewhere in our canvas. For example, putting it in columns. Let's move these around, and what we have is something very similar to a calendar. Another common chart we can create is a year-over-year chart. In a brand new worksheet, another way we can access our date parts and our date values is by simply right-clicking on the date field before we drop it onto the canvas. And in here, these are our discrete date parts, and these are our continuous date values. So for this particular example, let's simply choose our discrete month date part. And notice as well that the symbol right beside our date parts is a number sign. We're going to refer back to this later on. Let's click on OK. Let's take our measure, put that in rows. So what we are seeing in here is actually just monthly sales. The numbers that we are seeing is the cumulative sales for that particular month for all the years in our data source. But we can also elect to introduce our discrete year date part. So for example, if I drag order date onto color, let's set the width to entire view. Let's adjust our formatting, right-click, rotate the label, and perhaps in here we only want the abbreviation of the month. Let's close the formatting sidebar, and let's also show our highlighter. So in this case, we can easily see each year's performance, but still leave the performance of the other years in the background. One more note I'd like to make for discrete date parts is the actual date function that produces these values. Let's open up a calculated field editor. So on the dropdown, create calculated field. Let's first drag over the year of order date pill. What we are seeing in here is that the function that produces this value is coming from a date function called datepart. If we expand the function list by clicking on this arrow and putting our cursor on the datepart, we are going to find that datepart is a function that returns a part of the given date as an integer. Remember when we opened up our drop field editor, when we right-click drag a field onto our canvas, we see that the icon right beside our date part is actually a numeric field. Just to cross-check, let's drag over month as well, and we should see that both of these pills have been generated using the function called datepart. Let's close this, and let's open up a brand new worksheet. Let's have a look now at the difference between our discrete date parts and our continuous date values. So let's drag over order date and a measure, for example, sales. On the drop-down of our year order date, which is by default a discrete date part, instead of this first option, how about let's select the second option? We know by default this is going to give us our date value, which is by default a continuous field. So on the drop-down, year. So right now, we don't see much difference, but we did see this graph extend a little bit. Is what we have in columns is a green pill. So what we have in our x-axis is actually not a series of headers. It is a date axis. Let us also try to notice what happens when we click on the plus sign on this pill. And I would like you to pay attention to what happens to this pill as well as what happens to this chart. We can also monitor the number of marks that are being shown at the bottom of your screen. So when we click this plus sign the first time, it will give us quarter. But notice that unlike our discrete date parts, we do not get additional pills. We still see just a single green pill. We see that this chart is now a little bit more detailed, and if we take a look at the number of marks on the bottom of the screen, we can see that the original number of marks has been multiplied by 4. And this is because you have 4 quarters in a year. And we are looking at 4 years. Let's expand it one more time. We notice the same behavior. In this case, still a single pill. We get more detailed charts. And now we actually get 12 points. because we have 12 months in a year and we are showing 4 years. So what we should see is that as we drill down, we're actually displaying more and more detail. The graph becomes busier and busier, but the chronology stays intact. April 2017 still follows or lags behind April 2018, and it lags behind April 2019. We don't move around the order of the individual pieces that make up the date. And as for the type of charts that we can create with continuous date value fields, it's mostly these time series graphs that allow us to show changes over time. We can adjust this to use an area mark instead if we want to. Let's bring this back to a line chart. And yet one more possibility is what we call a slope chart. So let me just introduce category right now. So I'm going to drag this over to color. And we can see that this chart is actually very busy. A slope chart allows us to retain only the first and the last values and connect it using a straight line. We can technically do this using discrete date part fields, but we can also do this using our continuous date value fields. So let us create a calculated field that lets us retain the first and the last points of this chart. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this first or last. And we can use some table calculation utility functions to determine these points. So first, which is a function, if this is 0 or last equals to 0. There will be a separate video talking about the table calculation utility functions. But for now, the first equals 0 retains the first point, and the last equals 0 retains the last point. So let's click on OK. And let's drag this over to our filters and only retain if this is true. So let's show our highlighter for category. So on the drop-down, show highlighter. And the slope chart allows us to see just the first and last points. Again, we are taking away all of the other busy points because we may just want to see where we started and where we are right now. Let's bring this pill back to year first. So let's go to year. Let's open up our calculated field editor. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. And similar to what we've done for the discrete date part, let's take a look at the function that actually generates these values. So if we drag over this year of order date, which is a continuous date value, drag that over, we can see that the function is actually a date trunc. And this is different from a date part. Remember that the date part returns an integer. The date trunc truncates the specified date, but it doesn't return an integer. It returns a brand new date. So for example, if we are truncating to a quarter, what we are going to get is still a full date that has a year, a month, a day, and potentially time components. So let's recap. A date is composed of multiple parts, like the year, the month, the day. If we are looking at a date part, we are treating the date like Lego pieces, as in we can disassemble the pieces and each piece now becomes independent of others. For example, if we choose to just pluck out month, this month now acts independent of the year when it happened. And because we have different pieces, we can put together different combinations in different orders that don't necessarily follow a chronological date. This allows us to find different perspectives about the data, and we can use charts like a cycle plot, a heat map, and a highlight table for visualization. A date value is a date that is always taken in the context of time. It is always chronological. It is always sequential. One analogy I can think of is a ball of yarn. We may decide to unpack this ball of yarn, but when we do that, we are simply displaying more and more of the yarn. We are simply displaying more and more of the details. But the beginning of the yarn is still the beginning, and the end of the yarn is still the end. This is very different with date parts, where each piece can be placed outside of a chronological context. So now, the question is, what does this have to do with blue and green then? Remember that blue and green pertain only to how we want to display our data. Blue or discrete pills give us headers, and green or continuous pills give us axes. So let's take a look at Tableau. If, for example, what we have is a discrete date part, in this case we have month of order date. If we decide to change this to continuous, so let's click on the pill, and in here selecting continuous instead of the default discrete, what we should see is that these labels are actually converted into an axis. So let's try this out. So on the drop down, continuous. This may surprise you, but the month names are really just numeric values. And it's very easy for Tableau to convert this into an axis, and we can see that we actually have months 1 to 12 with a padding of 1 on both ends. We're also going to notice that we are losing the plus sign. This is no longer a hierarchy. This is not a date anymore. This is just simply a numeric value displayed as an axis. If what we have is a continuous date value, so right now we have this continuous chart, if we change this to discrete, what we should expect is that all of these points will now have labels. So on the drop-down, selecting discrete, and what we are seeing right now is that each point is now associated with a discrete label. So this is not an axis anymore, it's simply a series of labels. So if we are to compare date part and date value side by side, a date part is by default discrete, therefore it's a blue pill. A date value is by default continuous, which is a green pill. When we expand the hierarchy, the blue pills expand to multiple pills, and these pills become independent pills that can be moved around. A date value, when we click on that plus sign, it still retains a single pill. We do not create any extra pills. But what you're going to see in the chart is just more and more details. And it also retains the chronological order of the data. Date part and date value, both of them can be blue or green pills. So both of them can either be discrete or continuous. We can decide to display them either as headers or axes. If we drag the date part and the date value in a calculated field editor, we are going to find that the date part uses a function called datePart, and this returns an integer value. If we do the same for a date value, we're going to find that the function is actually a date trunc, and this returns a field that is a date data type. I'd like to demonstrate one more thing we can do with date parts. We can create our own custom date hierarchy. So in Tableau, we can start by creating a custom date. We can right-click on our date field. So right-click, create, and there is an option in here called custom date. It is also interesting and important to note that this is probably one of the very few places where you can find reference to the terms date part and date value. So it's actually right there. So to create a custom date hierarchy, we can decide to create a few fields that are date parts. Let's start with year. Let's select date part, click OK. That field gets created on the sidebar, and notice that the data type is number. And let's create one more. Right-click order date, create, custom date, and this time around, let's choose month. So drop down, use month. And we're also going to choose just date part. Note that both of these are numeric values. One way to create a hierarchy is to simply drag one of the fields on top of the other. So I'm going to take month, drag it on top of year, and it's going to prompt me for the name of the hierarchy. And let's just simply call this custom date hierarchy. Please also note that if the order is incorrect, you can simply just swap the order of the pills. So you can easily rearrange these. So you're probably asking, why would I want to have a custom date hierarchy? And the most common reason is the natural hierarchy might be too many levels. So for example, if we have a chart and we don't necessarily want our end users to be able to go to quarter, to month, to day, and if we have time to hour, minute, and seconds, we can limit that by creating our own hierarchy. So let's clear this worksheet. And this time around, let's take a look at our custom date hierarchy. Let's get our measure. And we can see that this is really just 2 levels down. So it could be a little bit cleaner and easier to navigate. This was a long but comprehensive introduction to dates in Tableau. We looked at default properties, and we did a deep dive on date part and date value and how these are different from blue or green, or simply just being discrete or continuous. We also got to see a few charts like the cycle plot, heat map, highlight table, as well as our typical time series graphs and slope chart. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.